Welcome to Austin Liti Limits, a series where authors talk to authors about books and writing. I'm Scott Simmergren.
And I'm Larry Brill. You know, Scott and I have had our share of successes.
And awards.
His last novel, To Squeeze a Prairie Dog, won 3 book awards. His latest novel, The Benevolent Lords of Sometimes Island, has been getting great reviews.
Larry has won his share of awards too. His latest book is out now, The Printer and the Strumpet. Here at Austin Liti Limits, we're working with our good friends at Book People to introduce readers to our favorite authors.
Well, naturally, during these days of pandemic, we've had to move our author interviews online until the bookstore is up and running again 100%.
In this interview, I had a chance to sit down with East Texas legend Joe R. Lansdale.
Joe was born, raised, married, and still lives in East Texas. He's been writing short fiction and articles, novels, and even comics for going on 50 years. His novel, The Bottoms, won the Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America, and I'll give you a taste of that in our next video. But first, Scott talked with Joe about what it takes to turn out so many varied published works and other fun stuff.
Joe R. Lansdale is the author of over 30 novels and numerous short stories. His work has appeared in national anthologies, magazines, and collections, as well as numerous foreign publications. He has written for comics, television, film, newspaper, and internet sites. His work has been collected in 18 short story collections, and he has edited or co-edited over a dozen anthologies. Lansdale has received the Edgar Award, 8 Bram Stoker Awards, the Horror Writers Association Lifetime Achievement Award, that's a mouthful, and many others. Yeah. The Sundance Channel has adapted his Hap and Leonard novels for television. He lives in Nacogdoches, Texas with his wife, dog, and 2 cats. Welcome to the show.
Only one cat now, one cat deceased.
Okay, welcome to the show, Joe R. Lansdale.
Thank you.
Down
well,
one
you know,
cat.
I'm going to make a little correction. It's 50 novels and 40 short story collections.
I figured you'd probably correct me because every time I look it up, it's like a ticker. It just keeps going up and up and up.
Yeah, that's really old there. But there's a lot of different, versions of my output that are out there on different sites and different things and stuff like that. But probably the one on Wikipedia is the closest one to being accurate about everything in general. So that's
that
the one
you
I
update yourself or?
No, I don't, but there's fans that update it, and there's one specific one that makes a really concentrated effort to do so.
Right. So before we get started with the questions I've prepared, let's just tell folks about your new book that's coming out just real quick, kind of give them a quick intro to what it is. I believe it's called Moon Lake. Can you tell us a little bit about that before we get into the other questions?
Yeah, Moon Lake is, it takes place in 2 different periods of time. It takes place in the late 60s and then in the late 70s. The 60s is where it begins when the main character, I think he's 12 or 13, I don't remember exactly. But the mystery is that this lake in the past used to be a town, and it was flooded with water, which has happened in many places. And so the town is beneath it, but also they find out that it was flooded with people still in the town. The poorer section and the black section, they flooded it. And they told them that they were going to do it, but they held out and wouldn't move. So they did it anyway. And they murdered all these people in a sense. And I don't want to say too much because it's got a lot of complex elements to it. But the thing is, everything in the book is tied to that event and maybe some things prior to that event. And we discovered that there's a very nefarious group at work to profit off of people in a very negative sort of way. And this young man, his father drives him off the bridge to commit suicide. The child survives, is rescued by a black family who take him in. He's white, and he stays with them for a while up until they finally find his aunt who's been traveling overseas, and he goes to live with her. And then as he gets older, he becomes a newspaper reporter in the 70s, and he goes back to find out what's going on. And then things get really complicated, and I hope very mysterious and interesting.
Is this town called Houston? Sounds like something that would happen in Houston.
It's called Long Lincoln.
So this is very interesting because you deal with racial injustice in a lot of your work. And this is a good segue into the book that I actually read before this interview, because I had really wanted to read this book called The Bottoms, which takes place in the 30s, but also deals with racial injustice. So can you talk about that a little bit? What's your fascination with wanting to have that in your work?
Well, you know, the racial injustice is something that if you grew up in the South, you grew up around. As a black friend of mine said, at least for you, you could take a white break, meaning that I didn't have to deal with it specifically every day, even though I was observing it, you know, sometimes close up as a child. And it's one of those things is, fortunately, I didn't see anything like lynching or anything like that, but I saw such mistreatment and humiliation and a dedicated viewpoint that can only be described as negative toward black people. And so all of that was kind of like a scar on my soul. I've never had white guilt in the sense of feeling guilty because I'm white, nor have I had personal guilt in myself, but I've had the guilt of humanity for anything like that. Not just that particular racial aspect, but for any race that's mistreated or for anybody because of whatever reason. I'm an atheist, and I believe in, religious rights. I believe that people should have the right to worship what they want, but that doesn't mean I respect their right, not their religion,
Right.
But you've got to do that. You've got to respect that right. And black people, I never, understood exactly what was going on because I was a child. I knew that it was odd. And then later I knew that it was wrong as I got older. Mark Twain and Harper Lee actually, and my mother, those things actually taught me that. They changed that. My parents, and I would say especially Huckleberry Finn, when I read it, I thought, oh my God, now I get it. I understand what's being said here, but as a child, I remember once going to a theater and I saw all the black people going up to the balcony from outside stairway. And I said to my mother, I said, why aren't those people going up there? And she said, I don't understand it. I can't explain it, but it won't always be that way. And I remember that as a child. And obviously, I don't think that I had this golden epiphany at that moment, but I never forgot it. And then later on, as other things happened, I began to, kind of collect all of these experiences and all of these thoughts and all of these impressions. And so I think it was inevitable that a large part of my work would be about it.
So I have one more question about The Bottoms. So
Sure.
the story is both nostalgic and horrific at the same time. And how did you find yourself balancing that when you were writing it? It would almost seem like the horrific part would just overshadow the nostalgic part, but everyone longs for where they grew up, even when there's bad things that happen. So how did you balance those two things when you were writing The Bottoms?
Well, keep in mind that this was the 1930s and I wasn't born until 51. But my parents were in their late, my father was in his early 40s. My mother was in her late 30s when I was born. My brother and I are about 17 years apart. So I grew up and we grew up poor. So it wasn't a terrible difference from the Depression. It was better than when they had it then. But also I grew up with all the stories of the Depression. My grandmother and my uncles who had all gone through that, it was a constant refrain. They saved string and rubber bands and anything, and eat all your food and all of these kind of things that they had to do during the Great Depression in their young adulthood had stuck with them. And therefore I grew up with those stories about that time. So I always feel that nostalgia is a two-edged sword. It's one of those things where, like, when I look back on the 50s and 60s, there's a lot about that. I think, man, that was a good time. And then I think if I were Black, if I were gay, if I were female, and being poor had its limitations too, which is why, I got out of that eventually, thankfully. So we're not looking at the fact that our parents are worried about paying their bills or that our parents are are worried about how they're going to feed us or put a roof over our head, get enough gas in the car to go to work. So their times are when they were younger and when they felt less pressured. Though if you go back far enough, those pressures began early. My father never had a day of school and went to work at 8 years old when his mother died. And so it's a totally different thing. And in the 50s is when teenagers, as we think of them, were created. And so, we tend to look back on our youth when we didn't have to deal with those things. God, what good times those were, where our parents were like sweating bricks, trying to worry about things and thinking like, man, I wish I was, back in the 40s or the 30s, even though it was World War II. So whatever's going on when you're young, you look at it with a different perspective.
Sure. So I saw in another interview that when you were a boy, you loved reading Classics Illustrated.
Yes.
I went down to the comic book store.
Buffalo Bill. I remember that.
I'm gonna send you this if you want it. But this was actually
want it.
This is from 1953, and I also found another. Although this isn't Classics Illustrated, here's one of Tarzan. This is a gold key.
Yeah, the gold key. Those were wonderful.
Right. So what was it about these, first of all, that sparked your attention rather than just reading novels? And then second, what's kept you fascinated with comics, into your career? Because I know you write for comics.
Yes.
And you wrote for Batman as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, the comics were the first thing I read. I was a reader by the time I was 4. My mother taught me to read. And, I read some children's books, but comics were my passion. And superhero comics, just like, a lot of kids. But when I discovered the Classics Illustrated, they opened up a whole new world to me, because there were all of these stories and novels that had been put together for, sometimes they were adapted in a way that they left certain things out or whatever. They were really pretty close. And they led me to read the actual novels and short stories, or at least a large part of them. And I'm a ravenous reader, and even more so when I was younger. And so the comics were the natural progression to fiction. And also the other thing that I should mention is that Edgar Rice Burroughs, you held up the Tarzan, was probably the first writer I read that made me realize not only did I want to be a writer, I had to be one. And Edgar Rice Burroughs, he's of his time, and there are a lot of things there are a lot of isms that he has that you can, look at and go, ouch, there's racism, there's sexism and all that. But man, was he a storyteller. And again, it's that whole thing, you can't toss the whole thing out because of an era in which he existed. And you got these hints from time to time that he didn't necessarily believe that strictly, And even if you didn't, you weren't, when you're a kid, I wasn't thinking about those things. And I was of my generation too. And but they were magical to me, and it made me say, I've got to do this. And so by the time I was 11, I think I was reading the Burroughs books and the other books that like Mark Twain and Jack London and Rudyard Kipling, and who are writers I constantly return to. They're not the only ones, but they're certainly premier writers. And now and again, I'll reread some of the Burroughs openings and endings, because his middles were kind of like everybody gets in a fight here, the girl gets rescued, the kind of monotonous, but his openings were magical, and his closings were generally very, very magical. And I've tried to keep that and the momentum of those things in the work I do now, even if I try to do what I like to believe is maybe more sophisticated most of the time. But also those led me, because they were adventurous, to watching the Tarzan movies and serials that they played on television. And so television, especially the early television with Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, all that had a tremendous effect on me, because they were pure storytelling. And so as I began to learn about pure storytelling, I gradually began to learn how to write characters and how to write dialogue and how to write with a style that, left something to taste after you read, had some echo after the reading. And that may not be true of all of my work, but I like to believe it's true of a lot of my work. And I owe all of that to comics.
Joe Lansdale, you're doing all right. Don't forget that.
Doing okay. I won't lie about it.
So let's talk about the actual work of it then. So if you have an idea for a story and you're going about planning what you're going to do for a session, how detailed do you get in that planning? And you consider yourself a pantser, or do you actually plot things out pretty detailed? How is
I
that
don't
kind of?
plot at all. I don't plot at all. I just get up in the morning, and go to work. I have no idea what's going to happen next. I don't even know what my next novel will be till I start it. And what happens is I have, once in a while I'll have, oh, I'll know, I'll write about that in a very general way. But what I tend to do is I develop a feeling. It's almost like an emotion. It's not a plot. It's not anything. It's just this emotion that I want to put on the paper. When I wrote The Bottoms, I wanted to put all of those feelings that I got from hearing my parents' stories and from reading about the Great Depression, and from being a fan of mysteries. And I thought there's got to be a way to put this together, and it just kind of went to my subconscious. Now I think your subconscious plots, or mine does. I think mine does, but I'm not aware of it. I just know at one moment, hey, that's ready. I'm going to start writing it. I wonder what back in those days, or this and that, whatever it is I put down, usually the next line comes and the next line comes. The hardest novel I've ever written was Moon Lake. And I think it turned out fine, and it may be that there's a certain malaise during this whole COVID era that made me feel like, even though I'm doing what I normally do, I stay home, I work about 3 hours a day. I start when I get up in the morning, and then I'm done. I proof it as I go, and then I do a polish. Every once in a while, I'll have a slight difference in that. But the closest I ever come to outlining was like right on the back of an envelope. Remember, the eyes are blue, because I might say they're blue here. I want to be sure that I'm consistent with that. Or his name is Bill, like a side character, not Bob,
Right.
because if I forget, I might change that name. So for me, that's about as close as I come to that. But I think my subconscious works, very carefully. And so when I wake up in the morning, I just go, I know what's now. And as soon as I can get my cup of coffee and get to the machine, I'm great. And I don't always write 3 hours. Sometimes it's 30 minutes to an hour, because sometimes I can do 20 pages in 45 minutes if it's boiling in the back of my subconscious. Most of the time it's about 3 hours, and I have a minimum I try to do 3 to 5 pages a day, but I often do 10 and 15.
Right.
I'll just have a day and if that happens, say 8 or 9 times during the process of writing a novel, and you're averaging 3 to 5, maybe 7 or 8 those days, you get a novel done relatively quick. And so
Right.
I'm just telling a story that I want to be told.
Yeah. So thanks, Joe Lansdale. All right, this is the time in our show where we do what we call the lightning round. It's a
Uh-oh.
concept we stole from Inside the Actors Studio, but they stole it
Okay.
from Marcel Proust, and he stole it from Bernard Pivot. It's a well-used format. Are you ready for the lightning round, Joe
I'll
Lansdale?
do the best I can.
Okay. What is your favorite word?
Oh, you don't want to hear.
Now, I want to hear it.
Yeah, because it'll be a vulgarity for other people.
That's okay.
Pussy.
All right. What's your
Happy?
least favorite word? What's your least favorite word?
Can't.
Can't. Excellent. What turned you on?
Life. No, that's silly, but that's the truth.
Man, my wife made a blueberry coffee cake the other day, and I was just in heaven. I was thinking just like
But
what you
see, that's
said.
life.
That's
That's all
life right
part of
there.
it.
Yeah. So what turned you off?
I think hatred. It's not that I don't hate a few people. I do. I don't want to become this saint, because I'm not. There's some people I don't wish dead, but I don't miss them either. But on the whole, mostly those are the people that have spent so much time hating that I have to admit a little of it's rubbed off on me, and I don't care that they're gone. But generally, I try to avoid that. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Excellent. All right. Who is your favorite author? There we go.
That's a tough one. Because it varies a little bit. I think short stories. I really like Flannery O'Connor. I really, really love her work. Novelist. My favorite book is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, because it was one of those changeable books and during the right time for me, as well as the film. So the book, but favorite author, man, that's a toughie. I really like Ray Bradbury and Raymond Chandler, and I like Hemingway a lot. And people go, "Oh, Hemingway was a jackass." Yeah, he was, but boy, could he write.
So if you could be a character from a well-known novel, who would you be?
Oh man, those are always tough. Well, I would be John Carter of Mars. You know,
Of
I
course.
always thought when I was a kid, I would go out and hold my arms up to what hope I was going to be, sucked off to Mars. And then one day it occurred to me, my God, I wouldn't last 15 minutes. I'm a kid and I don't know anything about swords. I'd be fighting Tharks. I better stop this. I might actually get sucked up there, you know? And that was the brilliance of Edgar Rice Burroughs, was that he can make a young person believe that this stuff was real. When he wrote in first person, I thought, my God, this is real.
Yeah, I agree. So what other profession besides your own would you want to attempt?
Well, I've taught at the university, as an adjunct, and I enjoyed that. But after I did about 8 years, I do about a semester, sometimes 2 semesters. Excuse me, 2 classes a semester, but usually a class a semester. Sometimes in the summer, I like teaching. I enjoyed that.
So what's a profession that you would least want to do?
I did a lot of those already. I worked in aluminum chair factory, and I really hate that. I sometimes have dreams of that all this is a dream, and that I'm really still working in the aluminum chair factory. I really didn't like that. I worked farm jobs. I dug ditches. My mother said, if you don't get a college education, you're going to end up digging ditches. My first job was digging ditches, and I thought about that, afterward, and I tried to get an education. I just could not afford more than 60 hours over about a 4-year period. But at some point, I realized I wasn't always interested in what they were interested in. And as a reader, I didn't always have the same viewpoints that they had. And I thought, you know what? I think it was at Mark Twain talking about, that it was that studying formally was getting in the way of his education. I began to feel that way because I never wanted to have an education just for a job. That was never an interest. My mother always taught me that having an education was a fuller way of looking at life. It was a way of living happier. And I believe that. So I continued to try to educate myself. I have a slight feeling that I wished I'd have gotten a degree. There's a part of me that wished I had, but there's another part of me that glad I didn't waste that time after I started selling nonfiction first and then fiction, because it wouldn't have helped me at all. I've just still done just what I'm doing, or I might have gotten caught up in academics, and oh my God, no thanks. Yeah. So, I'm doing what I want to do.
Excellent. All right, last question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
Oh, did you bring your dog?
Excellent. Thank you, Joe Lansdale, for being on our show. It was an honor to talk to you and to meet you again.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, good. 45 years later.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. Thank you very much.